Last session for Genesis, and we're covering a lot of material, so hopefully I'll try to get through this as well as I can. There's only a few major storylines, and we'll try to cover them that way. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, please be with us tonight as we finish reading from the book of Genesis. As we read Joseph's story, may we learn more about what you intend for our lives and how our lives are in relationship with you. Amen. So we're covering essentially 11 chapters tonight. So we'll start with the normal affirmations that we do. God creates creation, has a specific purpose for it. The relationship between God and creation develops through speaking and listening. God's word to creation is a sovereign call, but it's a kind of call which invites obedience rather than demands allegiance. God loves creation, but creation refuses to let God be God. And the relationship between God and creation is marked by tension between God's purposes and creation's resistance to God's purposes. So, the title that the book has for these chapters is The Fulfillment and Resolution of the Dream. We were introduced to the Joseph as a dreamer last week, and dreams factor to a great extent in the narratives that we cover tonight. So it's a resolution of the dream, and I would suggest that dream is not just a dream that Joseph has, but the dream that is set before Joseph for his life. One could maybe even say that the dream that God has for Joseph and Joseph's family. So setting the stage, a lot of what we're going to cover is, again, talking about God's providence. And sometimes in our lives we feel like maybe we're missing out in God's providence, or there's some things that don't feel like God's promises, or maybe we need God's promises. So these are the questions that were suggested by the Leader's Guide to kind of open up our thoughts before we get into reading the scripture. What kinds of things make you question God's providence? Yeah, I mean, that's the clearest examples when bad things happen, when tragedies happen, when there's things that happen, you go, God, are you really paying attention? Or God, do you really care for us? Are you caring for us? So certainly those things that can happen on a global stage, or a community stage, but certainly also in our personal lives, can cause us to question God's providence, either for the world or for us individually. We have a basic, that's not to question that we don't have faith in God's providence in general, but as we live our lives, sometimes we have cause to say, okay, it doesn't seem like providence right now. Where is the providence, God? Okay, how about what causes you to feel reassured that God is in control of life?
Sometimes
Yeah. That's it's kind of fun when that happens, isn't it? When things just fit together. Like you said, it fall in place when they just, okay. Maybe you're worried about something and you get a phone call and it just makes it all right. Or just happenstance. And sometimes we can overlook those, right? We can almost take them for granted. Okay, so getting into the scripture. We're separated into three basic sections. So the first section that we're going to look at is chapters 39 through 41. And because there's 11 chapters, I'm going to ask your forgiveness. I'm not going to read through them tonight, or we may be here all night. So what happens in the first section is what is called seduction and refusal. Any guesses on what that's about? Potiphar's wife. So the story is, so what the narrative tells us is that after Joseph is brought to Egypt, he's sold to essentially a rich executive, it'd be equivalent to somewhat of a governor, not a governor of the whole land, but maybe a regional governor who was wealthy, had a lot of land, had a lot of power, had a lot of influence. And he needed a servant, and so he buys Joseph as a servant. What Brueggemann points out in his commentary on this is that there's two kinds of knowledge going on. There's what is called the omniscient knowledge that we as a reader have. We know certain things about Joseph that the characters in the story don't know. They have limited knowledge. What Potiphar and even Potiphar's wife recognize is that Joseph is special. A lot of their judgment of that is external judgment. Joseph is handsome and strong and smart, and they recognize that immediately, that he has gifts, that he has talents. And Potiphar puts that to use, and it's very quickly he recognizes that he does better. The more he gives to Joseph, the better off he is. That Joseph can be trusted, and not just trusted, but can be relied on for most, because Joseph not just has a good head on his shoulder, but he seems to be blessed. Everything he does seems to be blessed. What we recognize about this is that this is not just Joseph's unique talents, although he has them. It's what's made clear is that the Lord was with Joseph, that the blessing that Joseph has, or the special status that Joseph keeps throughout the narrative, throughout all the chapters, is not just his own ability, but the fact that God's providence, God's hand is upon him, blessing everything he does. That even when things look like he's suffering or he's being punished, even when things look bad with Joseph, what we are giving a sense of, and there's a continuing theme of, is even when Joseph is being sold by his brothers, even when he is being accused by Potiphar's wife, even when he is languishing in prison, even when he's in the lowest points of his life, God's hand is still with him, so that even the dark points of his life lead to something else, and they are themselves blessed, that they lead to the next blessing. This can be the difficulty I had with reading is that this seems to, for me and to a critical reader, seems to be a little bit too easy. And can lead to some reductionist theology. What do I mean by that? I'm going to write down a phrase, see if you've heard it before. Everything happens for a reason. Have you ever heard that? What do you feel about that phrase? Do you think that's true or false, or not so true? Sorry, that wasn't me. You agree with that statement? It sounds like it's something that belongs in the Bible, doesn't it? It sounds like a truth, right? Just a innate truth. When a door closes, one door closes, another one opens. Yeah, we have a lot of phrases by that. We have a lot of similar sentiments about that. That is in the scripture. Everything, Lord.
Which isn't exactly that.
No. And what this leaves out is certain senseless things that happen for no reason. Senseless violence, senseless things that are just by themselves evil or wrong. What this type of sentiment leads to is a belief that it can become a justification for things that don't deserve to be justified. It can become too easy. It can become too easy of an answer. But in this story, what is being explored through Joseph and what is being taught through Joseph is that a direction in a person's life can make sense, and God can direct a person's life in such a way that many of the things that happen in their lives, both good and bad, can fit together, can lead to certain things. And we can find that in our lives, as sometimes a failure, what feels like a failure at this point in our life, teaches a lesson that leads us to success at another point in our life. That there seems to be a integrity of life that flows through and can make life make more sense than it does on the surface. So that's what I struggled with when I was rereading the story, is that I wanted to resist making it too easy, the story of Joseph too easy. Because what that does is that diminishes Joseph's struggles by almost saying that his struggles weren't really struggles because God was using them for good anyway. And that's too easy, and that minimizes what Joseph was going through. And the unfairness that Joseph met in his life. It was unfair that his brothers sold him into slavery because they were overcome by jealousy. That was wrong. That was evil on their part. In the story of Potiphar and Potiphar's wife wants David to sleep with her and keeps asking him to, and his integrity causes him to refuse because he knows, because it's one, his integrity of being loyal to the person who's entrusted him with all this power, Potiphar, and also he is keeping true to the type of person that he knows God expects him to be. So he sees that as not only as not helpful for him because he's betraying his boss, so it's literally not helpful to him, but it's also morally a sin. So he holds off, and he is essentially punished for doing the right thing. And the unfairness of that should not be overlooked. The unfairness of Potiphar's wife action and the reaction by Potiphar both are unfair to Joseph, and he does not deserve it. And if we say, even though, and if we just say, well, that's what God intended, just so that he could be put in prison, so then he can hear the dreams, and so then he could be to Pharaoh, because that's all God's plan, it makes it too easy. And what we know is life isn't that easy. Life isn't that linear. And a lot of times life isn't that logical. But at the same time, we can recognize that there is a force and there is a wisdom that is above us, that is running through our lives that we don't understand. And there's times in our lives when we do struggle, and in the midst of the struggles, there may be a wisdom or a truth that it resides there that we may not be able to see because we are in the heat of the moment. We are in the struggle itself. So this story begins that continuing theme of God's providence, which seems also, while it being true, seems also to be hidden. So that's what's going on first in this section. What is next is the dreams. So Joseph, as a result of Potiphar's anger, of Potiphar's wife's action and Potiphar's anger, is thrown into prison. And again, we hear the words, the Lord's hand was with, the Lord was with Joseph, even in prison. So immediately, again, his talents, his good looks, his strength, his quick thinking, his specialness is recognized this time by the captain of the guard, and he becomes essentially an assistant. He becomes a preferred prisoner, where he actually has almost his own way in prison. He is the captain's assistant. Yes, he's still in prison. Yes, he doesn't have rights of his own as a citizen, but he does have certain rights within that system. And in that role, he meets two people. One person is what is called a cupbearer, or essentially a personal attendant to the Pharaoh, his butler, in another way of putting it. And the Pharaoh was angry at him and threw him in prison, and the other was the chef. And Pharaoh was also angry at the chef. And each of them on the same night have a dream that startles them, that disturbs them, because they can't figure out what it means. And so Joseph says, well, tell me the dreams. I don't, and Joseph says from the beginning, he says, I don't interpret the dreams. God interprets it. I'm merely the best vessel for God to interpret the dreams for you, because the dreams come from God, not from me. And God is trying to tell you something. God is essentially foretelling what is going to happen. And I'm merely going to convey what God is saying to you through the dreams. And the first dream by the butler is one is a positive dream of him there being 3 vines and grapevines, and him drawing the juice from the vines into a cup and presenting them to the Pharaoh. And so Joseph says, well, what that means is in 3 days, the Pharaoh will essentially forgive you and restore you to your position. And the chef, thinking that, wow, that was a good dream. Maybe my dream's going to be as good. And so he has 3 levels of food on his hat, and the top level is being eaten by birds. And Joseph says it's also 3 days, but in 3 days you will be hanged by the Pharaoh. He will not forgive you, and he will take your head. In 3 days, both happen. The chef is executed. The butler is returned to the Pharaoh. And the butler, the cupbearer, returns to the Pharaoh, and Joseph only makes one request for him. He says, please remember me. But the cupbearer is so overjoyed or so caught up in being restored back to the position, he just forgets. He doesn't remember. And so Joseph has to languish in prison, what do they say, 3 more years? I think is what it is. So what happens in this prison, where it makes sense and where God is using this time for Joseph, is that he becomes established as a person who can interpret who is in touch with God so that he can interpret dreams. So when the Pharaoh has 2 dreams, he has 2 dreams in one night. The first dream is that there are 7 very fat, healthy, good-looking cows grazing along the Nile. And then there appears next to him 7 ugly, thin, sickly cows. And the sickly cows eat the fat cows, and they remain thin and sickly. He wakes up from that dream, and he goes back to sleep. He has a second dream, and there's 7 plump ears of corn that are gorgeous, and then 7 very small, thin, ugly-looking corn grow up next to him, eat the plump corn, and still remain sickly. So the Pharaoh doesn't know what to make of these dreams, so he calls all the wise men, all the magicians, every expert in all the Egypt. None of them can figure it out. And it's then that the cupbearer remembers, oh yeah, I remember this guy. He's a Hebrew. He was in the prison. He interpreted my dream and the chef's dream, and he was right on both counts. So Pharaoh brings him in. So the dreams are theonomous, which means they are from God. They are kerygmatic, which means they have a story to tell. And they are eschatological in that they talk about the end times, or they are future-oriented. So the role of Joseph is complex. Because on one hand, he is a formidable character. He is a person who has the power to, that God has given the power to interpret dreams. He, in very many ways, is in the catbird seat, but he is also a slave. He is also in prison. He is also vulnerable. So he's existing in 2 states at one time. He has needs and he has doubts as well. No doubt when he was in prison, there were times when he was doubting about God's providence. Not in a general sense. He still believed in God. He still believed in general in the providence of God. But no doubt he had some harsh and lonely nights where the doubts would arise up and say, does God care? We can imagine that that's happening. The narrator doesn't spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's always in the undercurrent of what's going on. So now, what these dreams have, these dreams that the Pharaoh is having is presenting a tremendous danger to the empire of Egypt. Because the Pharaoh is essentially seen as God of Egypt by the inhabitants of Egypt. The pharaohs were considered to be, if not gods themselves, divine-like. And so here's the fate, and and Egypt's wealth and power all resided from where? The Nile. And it's the Nile itself that is going to provide its greatest threat, because they understand that the famine, or the fruitful years, and the famine affects the Nile, which will affect their crops, which will affect their wealth, which will affect their very lives. And if that's happening, and the Pharaoh isn't able to do anything about it, then his control or his power in terms of the empire is shaken. The power of the empire itself is shaken. So the very threat, the very future of the empire is at stake. And Joseph is presenting them with that danger by interpreting the dreams. He says, look, you're going to have 7 years is going to be great. You're going to have very, very lush, fruitful years. The land was going to produce a lot. But then after that, there's going to be 7 years of famine, and that famine will be so severe that everything that you might have enjoyed before was going to be swallowed up, and you're going to be poor, and you're going to lose everything. And to the Pharaoh, it doesn't just mean losing food, it means losing power. And so the Pharaoh doesn't take any chances. So he appoints Joseph as he sees the wisdom, or in Joseph's words, and he says, I can't find anybody better to run put it into practice, what needs to be done, which is take advantage of the 7 years, set up storage, put everything so that when the famines come, we're situated well, not just for ourselves, but to actually gain more power and control. And so Joseph, as an administrator, actually gives life. His actions actually give new life to an empire in threat of failing. And so Joseph is not just seen as a right-hand person to Pharaoh, not just as a smart administrator. Joseph himself is seen by the people in almost divine terms as a life giver himself. And his shrewdness in this can be seen in how he manages this. He doesn't just store up stuff and then sell it. Yes, he does. But he changes the whole culture of Egypt. Notice the stages. First, the people of Egypt come to him and say, we need food. He says, okay, buy the food. So they use all their money and buy food that only lasts for so long. So then they come back to him and say, we need more food, and we don't have any money. He says, okay, give me your livestock. Give me your possessions. So they do. They get food. But then that runs out, and there's still famine. So they come back and they say, look, you got everything. You got all our money. You got all our possessions. You got all our livestock. He says, okay, give me your lives and your land. Become slaves. And so they do. And so ever afterwards, they pay 1/5 of whatever they make through the rest of their lives, and their children and their children's children are forever unexpected to pay 1/5 of their income to the government. Joseph institutes the first tax system. So, Joseph's status is changed from being a prisoner in a foreign land to becoming outside the Pharaoh, and somewhat and arguably maybe in front of the Pharaoh as the most powerful person in the land to which he was sold. He is changed from slave to ruler. And it's that situation where we come to the next part of the story, which is seen in chapters 42 through 44. What happens in this part of the story is that the famine doesn't just exist within the bonds of Egypt, it also spreads out so that it affects Joseph's family in Canaan. And it's good to look at the characters that are involved. Again, we are returned back to the brothers. And the brothers are in this story, when they encounter Joseph, find themselves in this foreign land with all the demands going on, they are overwhelmed by their own guilt. It becomes an activating factor in their lives. At different times, they recognize that their guilt comes to the forefront. They said they can recognize this wouldn't have happened to us if we hadn't treated Joseph so badly. And they come to that realization even before they know who Joseph is, which is significant. So strong is their sense of guilt over what they've done that they don't even understand fully what they have done and how it interacted. And so their sense of fate touches their understanding of God. They get that larger picture of how God's providence or God's control is in the larger picture. That what is fated, their fatedness, or what is fated for them, is God's work in their life. They don't necessarily see it specifically as God punishing them, but they can see how it is God is connecting them with their present lives with their past lives. What they've done in the past has affected their present and may affect their future. This becomes stronger to them as they get further into the narrative of their interaction with Joseph before they know who Joseph is. Joseph starts inquiring from them, who's your father? Did you have brothers? He starts exploring. He knows who they are. And so he's questioning them at a deeper level. They don't know who he is. They don't recognize him. But they are forced to revisit their relationship with their father and with their brothers. And so he puts them ever more intimate into their own guilt, ever more deeply into their own guilt. He places them even further and further and further realization of how their past has affected their present. And he does so by saying, okay, here's the grain, but I don't trust you. I think you're spies. So take this grain, go back to your brother, but leave one of them behind. One of you has to stay behind. And don't come back here until you have your other brother with you, the one that you didn't bring. Well, they go back to Jacob, and they tell him what happened to Jacob. And Jacob, through Jacob's grief, they are brought more deeply into their guilt. And they can't do that to their father. So they reside with their father until the grain runs out. So then they go back. And the only way they can go back is to bring Benjamin with them. And the only way they can get Jacob to release Benjamin is the fact that they literally can't survive without the grain. And also, Judah says, I will personally guarantee that Benjamin will come back. I will put my life in service of getting Benjamin back to you, Father. So Joseph then brings it up to the next level. He essentially frames Benjamin and threatens to hold Benjamin hostage. And this is where the brothers' guilt reaches its fullest. And they say, please don't. We betrayed our brother, who was our father's favorite. Benjamin is the only other son by his favorite wife. If we don't come back with Benjamin, he will die. And Judah steps forward, take me instead. And Joseph at that point realizes that they have come to the fullest extent of recognizing their own guilt and their own responsibility, that they have been transformed, that they're changed men. And it's then he reveals himself. And he brings Jacob back. So the brothers, so there's the power of guilt and there's sense of faith. So the next character is the father. The issue of grief is decisive. He makes all his decisions in the throes of grief. He won't let them go back to Egypt because he is still grieving over Joseph, and that grief causes him to fear to lose Benjamin as well. But in the end, he comes to the realization it has to be, and it's part resignation, but it's also the passion to say, bring my son home. He doesn't give up. So his faith, and this is where we are reminded back of what type of person Jacob is, how Jacob lived his life. Jacob does have faith, but his faith is always mixed with his own striving. He doesn't know, he is unable to separate them from each other. His passion, his drive to succeed or to survive is mixed with his faith in God. He doesn't have faith in God without his need to survive, and he doesn't have his need to survive without his faith in God. They are intermixed. And such is the case here. He doesn't have faith to send his sons back without his need to survive. But he doesn't have his need to survive, doesn't exist without his faith that God will somehow lead him. The relationship between Joseph and Benjamin is mixed. On one hand, Benjamin is treated by Joseph almost like a pawn in his game with his brothers, especially when he frames Benjamin, where he puts his cup in Benjamin's bag rather than in the others. He's using Benjamin to bring his brothers to realization, or to bring the climax to the story. So Benjamin is a pawn, but on the other hand, Benjamin is also his favorite brother. He gives him more portions. He blesses him more. He gives him more. treats him better. He has special status. So the reunion between Joseph and Benjamin is unresolved until we go to the next slide and we go to the next part, which is the disclosure. And this is 45 through 50. And this is where Joseph finally lets his brothers know who he is. And he brings Jacob to be with him. And so Jacob, in his old age, is given new life because his son, who he thought was dead, is now alive. And his fortunes have been restored. And yeah, he's in a foreign land, but he's not a trespasser. He's a welcome guest. He has power. He has influence. Indeed, so when Joseph says, "I am Joseph," it is a statement where it's the same framework that God uses to Moses in the burning bush. I am who I am. I am Joseph. And it's not a statement so much about him as a statement about what God has done. The brothers' reaction is dismay. And that's the final throes of their guilt. Because their reaction of finding out that it's Joseph, is what's going to happen to us? He's got all the power. We betrayed him. We sold him. We despised him. He has every right to seek his revenge. They are scared. They are dismayed. Not that their brother is alive, but they are dismayed by what their actions have led them to. But they are forgiven and saved. And Joseph's immediate reaction to them is words of assurance that they're saved and a promise. So empire mobilized, the father summoned. So now, those who were last, the family that was last, or the brother that was the most despised by the other brothers, who had the least amount of power in many ways, becomes the ruler of another country. And this family from a foreign land that should have no power in Egypt now has some of the best territory. Jacob is brought in to see the Pharaoh, and notice the power difference. What happens when Jacob meets a Pharaoh? Jacob is the one blessing Pharaoh rather than the Pharaoh blessing Jacob. So in that, God is sovereign. We see that God is sovereign. So then, but also note something else. I don't want to read portion, this is part where I want to read, which is kind of a unique, when I was rereading this, I noticed. In chapter 47, beginning with verse 7, then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. See. No, what I was thinking was actually happened before that. When Joseph presents his brothers to the Pharaohs. At one point, Joseph is essentially saying, "Don't tell the Pharaoh that you're shepherds, because Egyptians despise shepherds. Tell them that you raise livestock." But when the Pharaoh asks brothers, "What do you do?" "Oh, we're shepherds." But it's okay, and the Pharaoh still accepts them. So the power structure has shifted. Now the focus is, even though Pharaoh had all the power, now the power structure has shifted, where Jacob and his family almost are the power, Joseph and his family are almost the power structure. And when Joseph marries, he marries an Egyptian. When Joseph is buried, he's buried in Egypt. So he has changed the culture of Egypt. And that is God's providence, where Joseph, the last, becomes first. So there's family narratives. So the family narratives, there's a theophany where God speaks to Jacob, and Jacob knows he has to be buried not in Egypt but back home with his ancestors. Jacob is presented presented to the Pharaoh. When Jacob dies, they bury him there. Now Joseph, in the empire, like I said, he has changed his status. But before Jacob dies, he blesses a family, and the blessing is one of mixed family. To some of the brothers, his blessing doesn't sound like a blessing, but more like a curse. Reuben, he's harsh on. Judah, he's favorable to. Simeon and Issachar, he's pretty harsh. So, and what you see established is, now we see the 12 tribes of Israel, and we see their nature of what one is seafaring, one is more hardworking, one is more religious, one is meant to be on the throne. So Jacob is given a vision. It's almost like a theophany that says, this is how you, my sons, are going to live. This is what your families are going to be like. This is what your future and your future of your families are going to be like. So the 12 tribes of Israel are established. So that's the whole story. So at the end of Genesis, we see Joseph, also the death of Joseph. We see the change of Israel that God has affected, not only continued the blessing or the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Joseph, and established that lineage, but through that lineage has affected the culture around them, and so that the culture is different. But all that changes. The next book, Exodus, begins with, but a Pharaoh arises who has no memory, who has forgotten all this. And so now, this family of power then becomes slaves again. Systemology, cosmology, there's a certain amount of cosmological affects going on here, in the sense that there are supernatural powers going on through the dreams. Tends to be more epistemological in that, and how the truth is being revealed through the dreams. But we do have a sense of theophanies of God speaking. But the speaking of God now is more through the form of dreams and less direct. God isn't walking with them and talking with them directly. God is using dreams to communicate. Eschatology, there's a lot of talking about future and how lives are to end and how life is affected. Ethics, there's certain ethics going on. Joseph is though he, through his gaining of power, for the most part, has integrity and strong ethics, but his ethical treatment of his brothers, though understandable, can be questioned. Especially his treatment of Benjamin, his deceptions, his hiding from them of his true intentions. All of that is a little bit unethical, but it serves a larger ethical purpose, so it becomes a question there. In epistemology, again, we are faced with how God communicates, and how do we know the truth, and how do we know of God's providence even when it's when we're in the difficult times in our life. Critical themes: providence, sovereignty of God. Even when a sovereign God and provident who is providing for us, we still have those times where we question whether God is in control. In God's creation through mystery, sometimes it is by us not knowing that we become the most fruitful in our lives and we learn the most. Sometimes it is through the questioning and through the doubts that we come to new realizations that we didn't have before. There was and I'll close with this, there was a pastor in the 40s, probably one of the first of our nation's nationwide evangelists, in a way. He's a pastor of Riverside Church in New York City. His name was Henry Emerson Fosdick. And his sermons were broadcasted on radio throughout the nation. And at one point in his life, he had during his pastorship, during his ministry, I don't know if it was when he was at Riverside or maybe before that, but at some point when he was a minister, he had a nervous breakdown. And he he admitted himself into an institution, a mental health, for a while to get better. And he said what brought him out of that time of his life and brought him back to wealth was digging deep into prayer. And actually a book came out of it. It's called The Meaning of Prayer, and it's a series of devotions and things. But he's said that he made a statement that he believed that every pastor, every minister, in order to be an effective minister and preacher of the gospel at some point in their life needs to have a crisis of faith. Because until they do, they don't understand they don't understand the struggles of the very people that they are trying to help. All right. Again, sorry I went through fast, but it was a lot of people, a lot of things to cover, and I covered it in about around an hour. Did you guys all follow it? Did I lose you? Okay. Anything new that you didn't think of before? I think he did. I think there was certainly times where he felt it, but again, I think he was human, and there's other times where he probably doubted, or he just saying, "I don't know. I could just be I could be fooling myself."
But he seems to be one of the great figures in history.
Right.
And kind of comparable to someone like Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Who people recognized as there's something really special about him.
Yeah, and you sometimes wonder, certainly, like with Lincoln, he has a certain humility.
Well, he went through some
failures. Well, a lot of failures and a lot of heartache.
Yeah.
And, but you also got to believe that there's a certain amount of, at some point, there must have been some times where he must have felt that almost supernatural or a sense of calling and of purpose that told him that there's something special in maybe if it wasn't special in him, there was something special in what he was doing. Otherwise, one would wonder how he could have the strength to keep it up. My favorite Lincoln story was actually more of a story. It was a quote attributed to Mary Todd Lincoln. And she talks about meeting Abraham Lincoln at a ball. And she says, he came up to me and he says, "I want to dance with you very badly." And he did.